Please, don't leave my son.
Uma, you don't know what he's like when he's alone. What he hasn't done.
I know everything. That is exactly why I'm asking you to stay.
The machine beside the bed let out a steady, even beep, the only calm sound in a room full of tension. Annie's hand was locked inside a grip far stronger than it should have been for a dying woman. "Please," the old woman whispered, her fingers tightening around Annie's. "Don't leave my son." Sunlight cut clean through the blinds, striping the white sheets in gold. No shadows, no dead of night, just morning light pouring over a hospital bed, an IV line, and a mother who had maybe hours left, spending them on her son's wife instead of her son. Annie's bag sat on the chair beside her. Inside it, folded in a plain white envelope, were the divorce papers. Signed. Ready. She'd planned to hand them to Jingu today. She hadn't planned on this. "You don't understand what he's like when he's alone," the woman said, voice trembling but sure. "He's only ever been soft with you." Annie opened her mouth to answer, and that's exactly where we're leaving it for a second. If you're new here, welcome. I tell stories like this every week. Full emotion, full drama, twists you will not see coming. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you want to see how Annie answers a dying woman's last request, hit that subscribe button right now, because it only gets more intense from here. Annie's throat tightened. She looked at the woman's hand wrapped around hers. Thin, spotted, trembling, but somehow still commanding. The same way it had been the first day they met 3 years ago, when Jingu's mother had looked her up and down in the marble foyer of that Seoul mansion, and said, in accented but precise English, "So this is the American he chose." Interesting. Back then, Annie hadn't known if interesting was a compliment or a death sentence. She still wasn't sure. "Uma," Annie said quietly, using the word she'd been taught to call her, mother, even though nothing about their relationship had ever felt like family until this exact moment. "You don't know what he's done, what he hasn't done. I know everything," the old woman said, and something about the way she said it made the hair on Annie's arms rise. "That is exactly why I'm asking you to stay." The machines kept beeping, steady, almost mocking, in how calm they sounded compared to the storm going on inside Annie's chest. 3 years earlier, Annie had landed in Incheon with 2 suitcases, a business degree she wasn't using, and a marriage certificate she still didn't fully understand the terms of. Her older cousin had set it up, some tangled family favor between an import business in Atlanta and a logistics company in Seoul, that Annie later learned was a nice way of saying organized crime. She hadn't married Jingu for love. She'd married him because her family owed his family, and somewhere along the way, owed had turned into Annie goes to Korea and becomes somebody's wife. The first 6 months, she barely saw him. He worked constantly, came home smelling like expensive cologne and cheap gun oil, and communicated mostly in clipped Korean to his staff and clipped English to her. The household staff were terrified of her, not because she was scary, but because nobody knew what to do with an American woman who laughed loudly at her own jokes and refused to bow every time she entered a room. "You don't have to bow to me," she told the head housekeeper once, a stern woman named Mrs. O, who looked like she'd bitten into a lemon every time Annie spoke. "I don't bow to you," Mrs. O said flatly. "I bow to the house. The house doesn't have feelings, Mrs. O. Neither does Mr. Jingu, apparently, so we match." That had actually made Annie laugh, the first real laugh she'd had in weeks, and Mrs. O had almost smiled before catching herself and marching off like she'd committed a crime. It was little moments like that which had kept Annie sane in a house that otherwise felt like a beautifully decorated cage. She learned the rhythms of the place, when Jingu's mother liked her tea, which guards actually liked her, and which ones reported her every move, how to read the tension in a room before anyone said a word. She learned Korean faster than anyone expected, mostly out of spite, because she refused to be the outsider who needed everything translated for her. And somewhere in year 2, without meaning to, she'd fallen for a man who barely spoke to her. That was the humiliating part. Not the marriage of convenience. Not the isolation, the fact that somewhere between translating menus and learning to duck out of the way when his men cleaned their weapons in the hallway like it was a completely normal Tuesday, she had actually started to love him, and he had never once given her a reason to think he loved her back. "He is not like other men," his mother said now, snapping Annie back to the hospital room, back to the beeping machines and the golden light through the blinds. "He does not know how to show what is inside him. But I have watched him with you. I have seen things you have not." "With respect, Uma," Annie said, and her voice cracked slightly. "I've been watching him for 3 years. I think I'd know if there was something there to see." "You have been watching the outside," the old woman said. "I am asking you to trust me about the inside." Annie almost laughed, not from humor, but from the sheer absurdity of being lectured about her own marriage by a woman hooked up to a heart monitor. But there was something in the old woman's eyes, something desperate and specific, that made the laugh die in her throat. "Why does this matter so much to you right now?" Annie asked. "You're supposed to be resting," the doctors said. "The doctors say a great many things," his mother interrupted, waving a frail hand like she was swatting away a fly. "I do not have time to listen to doctors. I have things I need to say to you before I cannot say them anymore." A cold feeling spread through Annie's stomach. "What things?" The old woman's grip tightened again, and for a moment, the calm in her face cracked. Just slightly, just enough for Annie to see something underneath it. Guilt. Raw, aching guilt. The kind that had clearly been sitting in this woman's chest for a very long time. "There is something you do not know," she said. "Something I did, something I have carried for 2 years, and if I let you walk out of this marriage without telling you, I will die with it, and that would be its own kind of sin." Annie's pulse picked up. Whatever was coming, she could feel it in the air, the way you feel a storm before the first drop of rain hits. "Uma, you're scaring me." "Good," the old woman said, and for one strange second, something almost like her old sharpness flickered back into her eyes. "You should be scared. I am about to tell you the truth, and the truth in this family has always been dangerous. If you're feeling that chill creeping up your spine right now, trust it. This story is about to take a turn you did not sign up for. If you're enjoying it so far, hit that subscribe button, because what's coming in the next few minutes is going to make you understand exactly why I said this wasn't a happy story." The old woman took a slow breath, like she was gathering the last of her strength for something that mattered more than the air in her lungs. "2 years ago," she said, "you were pregnant." The room went silent, except for the machines. Annie felt the floor tilt beneath her, even though she was sitting perfectly still. "That's not possible," she whispered. I would have known. I would have told someone. I would have told Jingu." "You did not know," the old woman said, and tears were sliding freely down her weathered face now, the first tears Annie had ever seen from her in 3 years. "Because I made sure you did not know. I intercepted the results from the private doctor before they reached you. I told him there had been a mistake. I told him to say nothing." "Why?" Annie's voice came out strangled, barely audible over the sudden roaring in her own ears. "Why would you do something like that to me?" "Because you lost the baby 4 days later," the old woman said, and her voice broke completely now, crumbling into something raw and shattered. "Before you ever had the chance to know you were carrying it. And I told myself I was protecting you from grieving something you never got to hold. But that was a lie I told myself, so I could sleep at night." Annie couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory surfaced. 4 days in the hospital 2 years ago, that everyone had explained away as exhaustion, as stress, as her body finally breaking under the strain of a marriage that was eating her alive. Nobody had told her the real reason. Nobody had told her what she'd actually lost. "There's something else," the old woman whispered, her grip somehow tightening, even as her strength visibly drained from her body. "Something worse than what I did to you." Annie stared at her, tears burning hot down her own face now, bracing for whatever was coming next. "My son doesn't know either," she said. "Jingu has no idea he lost a child. I made sure of that too." The words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. "You?" Annie's voice failed her. She tried again. "You didn't tell your own son that his wife was pregnant, that she lost the baby. You let him live for 2 years not knowing." "Yes." The old woman didn't flinch from it. If anything, saying it out loud seemed to cost her something physical, like each word was being pulled out of her chest with a hook. "And I would make you understand why. even though I know understanding is not the same as forgiving. Try me, Annie said. Her hands were shaking now, and she didn't bother hiding it. You have seen him angry, the old woman said. You have seen him cold. You have not seen him grieve. I have. I watched it happen once before, when his father died, and it nearly destroyed everyone in this house. My son does not grieve quietly, Annie. He grieves with fire. He grieves with bodies. Annie flashed back, without wanting to stories she'd heard in whispers from the staff. About the 18 months after Jingu's father was killed, when half the organization's rivals had simply disappeared. She'd never asked for details. She'd learned early that some doors in this house were better left closed. So you decided for both of us, Annie said. You decided I didn't get to grieve my own child, and he didn't get to know his child existed, because you were scared of what he'd do. I was scared of who he would become, the old woman corrected, and her voice had a fierceness in it now that cut through the frailty. There was a war starting that year, with the Choi family. You do not remember because I kept it from this house as much as I could. If Jingu had lost a child in the middle of that war, on top of everything else, I do not believe he would have stopped until every Choi was in the ground, and I do not believe he would have survived doing it. Annie sat with that for a moment. Anger and grief tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate one from the other. That wasn't your choice to make, she finally said. Not for me, not for him. No, the old woman agreed. It was not, and I have known that every single day for 2 years. Do you know what it is like, Annie, to watch your son fall in love with his wife in small, quiet ways he thinks no one notices, and know that you are the reason there is a hole in his heart he cannot even name? That stopped Annie cold. He's not in love with me, she said, but it came out smaller than she meant it to. He is, the old woman said simply. He does not know how to say it. He was raised by a man who taught him love was a weakness you hid like a wound, so he learned to love the way he does everything else, silently, and from a distance, where it cannot be used against him. But wait, here's where it gets crazy. Because right as Annie opened her mouth to respond, the door to the hospital room swung open, and Jingu walked in. He stopped dead the second he saw them, his mother's hand wrapped around his wife's, both of their faces wet with tears, an atmosphere in the room so heavy it nearly knocked him back a step. What's going on? He said. Not a question. A demand. Low and controlled. In the voice Annie had learned meant he was seconds from losing that control entirely. Annie looked at the old woman. The old woman looked back at her, something pleading in her eyes now. Not for herself, but for him. Tell him, she whispered to Annie. Please. I do not have the strength left to say it twice. Annie's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Divorce papers. That's what she'd come here to deliver today. Not this. Not a dead baby neither of them had known about. Not a secret that had been sitting in this house for 2 years like a bomb nobody diffused. Jingu, she started, and her voice shook so badly she barely recognized it as her own. You need to sit down. I don't sit down, he said flatly, moving further into the room, eyes narrowing between his mother and his wife. I need someone to tell me why my mother looks like she is confessing a crime, and my wife looks like she just watched someone die. If you're new here, welcome to the chaos. This is exactly the kind of moment I build these stories around, so if you want to see how Jingu reacts to what he's about to learn, make sure you're subscribed, because trust me, this room is about to fall apart. The old woman's grip on Annie's hand loosened, like she was passing something heavy from her hands into Annie's, forcing her to be the one to carry it the rest of the way. 2 years ago, Annie said slowly, forcing each word out like she was walking across broken glass, I was pregnant. Jingu went very, very still. For 4 days, Annie continued, tears sliding hot and fast down her face now. I was pregnant with your child, and I didn't know it, because your mother made sure the doctors never told me. And then I lost it, and I never knew that either, because she made sure of that too. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Annie had ever heard. Jingu's face didn't move. That was the terrifying part. No explosion, no shouting, just a stillness so complete it felt like watching a building the exact moment before it collapses, when everything is already broken, but nothing has fallen yet. Say that again, he said quietly, and his eyes moved to his mother for the first time since he'd entered the room. Say it again, because I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Jingu, his mother started. "Say it again," he said, and his voice cracked down the middle, like ice giving way underfoot. Annie's whole body was trembling. She had come to this hospital with signed divorce papers in her bag, ready to end a marriage she'd convinced herself meant nothing to the man standing in front of her. She had not come here to watch that same man's entire world quietly shatter in real time. "There was a baby," she whispered. "Our baby. And we never even got to know." Jingu turned to his mother, and the look on his face was something Annie had never seen from him before. Not in 3 years, not once. It wasn't rage, it was betrayal so total, it looked almost like it was breaking something structural inside him. "How could you?" he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper now, more devastating than any shout could have been. "How could you take that from me?" The heart monitor beside the bed let out a single, sharp, irregular beep, then another. Then the steady rhythm that had filled the room since Annie arrived began to falter. The alarm on the monitor cut through the room like a blade. For half a second, nobody moved. Jingu frozen in the doorway with his mother's confession still hanging in the air between them, Annie still gripping the old woman's hand, like it was the only solid thing left in a room that had just come apart at the seams. Then the old woman's hand went slack in Annie's. "Uma?" Annie's voice cracked as she leaned forward. "Uma, look at me." The monitor screamed a flat, rising tone, and every ounce of anger drained out of Jingu's face in an instant, replaced by something that looked almost like panic, an emotion Annie had genuinely never seen on him before, not once in 3 years of gunfire threats, and rival family standoffs, and men twice his size flinching when he walked into a room. "Get the doctor," he barked, already moving, already at his mother's other side, his hands hovering over her, like he didn't know where it was safe to touch. "Someone get the doctor now." Nurses flooded in within seconds. Sol General's private wing didn't waste time when the family paying for the entire floor started shouting, and Annie was pulled back from the bed, gently but firmly, by a nurse who clearly recognized panic when she saw it, and wanted the family out of the way. Annie ended up in the hallway, back pressed against the cool wall, watching through the narrow window in the door as a team of medical staff worked over the old woman's small frame. Jingu stood just inside, refusing to leave, refusing to sit, refusing, Annie realized with a jolt, to let go of his mother's other hand, even as the doctors worked around him. Her own hands were still shaking, the divorce papers were still in her bag. It seemed like something from another lifetime now, another Annie, one who had walked into this hospital that morning with a plan and a purpose, and an ending already written. But wait, here's where the story does something you will not see coming. Because as Annie stood there, replaying the words "she is not the reason he's cold," he was raised to hide love like a wound over and over in her head. A man in a dark coat stepped out of the elevator at the end of the hallway. He didn't belong. Annie knew every face that was cleared to walk this floor. Jingu's people, hospital staff, the 2 guards stationed discreetly by the stairwell. This man was none of those things. He moved like someone who'd memorized the layout of the building without ever officially visiting it, and his eyes swept the hallway once, clocking Annie, clocking the guards, clocking the room number on the door, before his gaze settled and stayed. Annie's stomach dropped. She'd seen that particular kind of stillness before, the stillness of someone counting exits, not out of nerves, but out of habit, the same stillness she'd learned to recognize in Jingu's own men. She caught the eye of the nearest guard, jerked her chin subtly toward the man by the elevator. The guard's posture shifted instantly, hand drifting toward his jacket, and the stranger, noticing he'd been made, simply turned and stepped back into the elevator like he'd never been there at all. The doors slid shut. Annie's heart was hammering now for an entirely different reason. If you've been enjoying the tension so far, this is exactly the moment to hit that subscribe button, because I promise you, that man in the hallway is not the last surprise this story has for you. 15 minutes later, the alarm inside the room went quiet. Not because the worst had happened, Annie realized, sagging with relief against the wall, but because the old woman had stabilized. Her heart had faltered under the stress of the confession, the doctors explained through the door to Jingu in low, clipped Korean, but she was breathing on her own again, resting. For now. Jingu came out into the hallway a few minutes later, and Annie almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the ice. Gone was the control. What was left looked like a man who had aged 5 years in the span of 20 minutes, his usually perfect composure hanging off him like a coat 2 sizes too big. "She's stable," he said, before Annie could ask. His voice was hoarse. "For now. Jingu, not here," he said, cutting her off, but not unkindly, more like a man who didn't trust his own voice, not to break completely if she kept talking. His eyes flicked briefly down the hallway, toward the elevator, where the stranger had disappeared, and something tightened in his jaw. "We need to talk, somewhere private." "There was a man," Annie said quickly, "by the elevator. He didn't belong here, Jingu. He was watching the room." Something shifted behind Jingu's eyes, the grief momentarily eclipsed by something colder, sharper, more familiar. The version of him Annie had learned to survive around for 3 years. "Describe him," he said. She did. The dark coat, the stillness, the way he'd clocked every exit before his gaze even landed on her. Jingu's expression darkened with every detail, and by the time she finished, he'd already pulled out his phone, firing off something rapid in Korean to someone on the other end. "You think it's the Chwas," Annie said. It wasn't really a question. Jingu didn't answer right away. He glanced back toward his mother's door, then at Annie, and for the first time in the entire conversation, something almost like fear crossed his face. Not fear for himself. "If it's the Chwas," he said quietly, "then they know she's vulnerable right now, and they know exactly where to find both of us." Here's where the story loops back to something you need to remember. Divorce papers. Signed. Still sitting in Annie's bag. A marriage she'd walked in ready to end. And now, somehow, she was standing in a hospital hallway being pulled deeper into exactly the kind of danger she'd spent 3 years trying to survive around the edges of. "I need you to stay close to her room," Jingu said, already moving, already shifting back into the version of himself that commanded rooms and ended arguments before they started. "Don't leave her alone, not for a second." "Jingu, wait." Annie caught his sleeve before he could walk away, and for a second, neither of them moved, her hand wrapped around his arm, the same way his mother's had been wrapped around hers less than an hour ago. What she told us. About the baby. We can't pretend that didn't happen. Something raw flickered across his face, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. "I know," he said, voice low and rough. "But right now, if I stop to feel what I need to feel about that, people could die. Including her." He nodded toward his mother's door. "I have to compartmentalize, Annie. It's the only way I know how to survive days like this." "That's exactly what your mother said about you," Annie said softly. "That you learned to hide everything, so it can't be used against you." Jingu's eyes met hers, and for one long moment, the mask slipped completely. Grief, guilt, something that looked dangerously close to love, all of it laid bare in a hospital hallway under fluorescent lights. "She wasn't wrong," he said. Then he turned and walked away, already dialing another number, already becoming the man Soul feared again, leaving Annie standing there with her heart in her throat, and a war she didn't fully understand closing in on both sides. If you're feeling that tension right now, that's exactly where I want you. If you're enjoying this story, comment Part 2, because trust me, this is only the beginning of what's coming. Annie stayed by the door of the old woman's room for the next 2 hours, watching nurses come and go, watching the machines settle into a rhythm that no longer made her flinch every time it beeped. Somewhere down the hall she could hear Jingu's voice, low and controlled, cycling through calls in rapid Korean. Logistics, she guessed, though with him it was hard to tell logistics from something far darker. Mrs. O showed up an hour in, out of breath, clutching a bag of the old woman's things from the house, like she'd run the whole way from the car. "You?" Mrs. O said, stopping short when she saw Annie in the hallway chair. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't look at Annie like an outsider who didn't belong under this roof. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed," Annie said. "Why wouldn't I?" Mrs. O's mouth twisted, somewhere between a grimace and something almost gentler. "I heard you were leaving him. I heard you had papers." Annie's hand drifted, almost involuntarily, to the strap of her bag. The papers were still in there, still signed. "I did," Annie admitted. "I don't know what I have anymore." Mrs. O sat down heavily in the chair beside her, setting the bag between her feet, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then, unexpectedly, the older woman let out a short, tired laugh. "Do you remember," Mrs. O said, "the first month you were here, when you tried to make cornbread in the kitchen and set off the fire alarm so loud that 3 of Mr. Jingu's men came running with their guns out, thinking the house was under attack? Despite everything, despite the machines and the grief, and the man in the dark coat by the elevator, Annie felt a laugh bubble up out of her, unexpected and almost painful in how good it felt. In my defense, nobody told me Korean ovens run hotter than American ones. 3 grown men, guns drawn, over cornbread," Mrs. O said, shaking her head, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. "I have never seen Mr. Jingu laugh so hard as he did when he found out what actually happened. He didn't let anyone speak of it for a week, so no one would see him smiling about it." Annie's chest ached at that. A small, stupid, 3-year-old memory that suddenly felt like evidence in a case she hadn't known she was building. Proof that somewhere in this cold, guarded man, there had always been something soft reserved specifically for her, even when he never let her see it directly. "Why didn't he ever tell me that?" Annie asked quietly. Mrs. O's smile faded into something more serious. "Because he does not know how to hand you softness without also handing you a reason to use it against him. That is what this life does to a person. It makes tenderness feel like a weapon pointed at your own chest." Before Annie could respond, Jingu came around the corner, phone still in hand, but his stride had changed, sharper now, more urgent. "We need to move her," he said without preamble. "Move her? Jingu, she just stabilized." "That's exactly why," he said, crouching down so he was eye level with both of them, voice dropping. "The man you saw by the elevator, my people traced him. He's Choi's security, which means the Choi's know she's here, know she's weak, and know exactly which hospital wing to hit if they want to send a message." Annie's blood ran cold. A message like what? "Like taking the one person in this family everyone assumes I would burn the city down to protect," Jingu said grimly. "I need her moved to a secure location within the hour. Doctors are prepping her now. But wait, here's where it gets even more complicated." Because as the words left his mouth, Annie's phone buzzed in her bag. She almost ignored it. Everything happening in the hallway felt far more urgent than a text message. But something made her glance down. An unknown number. A single line of text in English, clearly meant for her specifically, not Jingu. "Tell your husband if he moves his mother, the next hospital bed will have your name on it instead." Annie's hands went numb. "Jingu," she said, and something in her voice made him stand up immediately, alert, reading her face like he'd read 1,000 dangerous rooms before this one. "Look at this." He read the message once, twice, and then something happened to his expression that Annie had genuinely never witnessed in 3 years of marriage. The ice cracked entirely, replaced by something molten and terrifying underneath. "They threatened you," he said, voice deadly quiet. "Jingu, it's fine. I'm not the one on life support. They threatened you," he said again, and this time his hand closed around his phone hard enough that Annie heard the case crack. "In writing, sent directly to your number, which means someone inside my organization gave them access to it, which means there is a leak inside my own house." If you're getting chills right now, good, because this story is only warming up. If you're enjoying it, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is going to flip everything you think you understand about this family. Though Jingu turned to Mrs. O, voice suddenly all business, all command. "Get her prepped for transport, now. Private route, not the main exit. The service elevator, the one only senior staff know about." Mrs. O nodded once, sharp, and disappeared into the room without another word, leaving Annie and Jingu alone in the hallway, with the threat still glowing on her phone screen. "I want you gone from this hospital within the next 20 minutes, Jingu said, turning back to Annie, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before. Not command, not coldness. Fear. Real, unguarded fear, on her behalf. "I'm not leaving your mother. You are not safe here," he said, closer now, closer than he'd stood to her, in longer than she could remember. "Do you understand what I am telling you? They know who you are. They know exactly what you mean to this family now, and that makes you a target, whether you signed those papers in your bag or not." Annie's breath caught. "How do you know about the papers?" Something flickered across his face. Not surprise, which was its own kind of answer. "Because I found them 3 days ago," he said quietly. In your desk. I have known you were leaving me for 3 days, Annie, and I did not say a single word about it, because I did not think I had the right to ask you to stay. The hallway seemed to tilt beneath her feet for the second time that day. Then why, Annie whispered, are you asking me to stay right now? Jingu's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking briefly toward his mother's door, toward the threat still glowing on Annie's phone, toward every danger closing in around both of them at once. Because for the first time in my life, he said, voice raw, I am more afraid of losing you than I am of anyone finding out that I care. Somewhere down the hallway, an elevator chimed. Both of them turned toward the sound at the exact same moment, and standing in the open doors, flanked by 2 men Annie had never seen before in her life, was a face that made Jingu go rigid beside her. Speak of the devil, Jingu murmured, low and lethal. That's Choi Min-jun, personally, which means this just became a lot more dangerous than a text message. If your jaw just hit the floor, mine did too writing this. Comment part 2 right now if you need to know what happens when Choi Min-jun steps off that elevator, because trust me, you are not ready for what comes next. Choi Min-jun didn't rush. That was the first thing Annie noticed about him. The unhurried way he stepped out of the elevator, straightening his cufflinks like he'd arrived at a business meeting instead of a hospital hallway where his men had just threatened a woman's life over text. He was younger than Annie expected. Younger than Jingu, even. With an easy, almost friendly smile that made the 2 guards flanking him seem entirely unnecessary. Until you looked at his eyes, which stayed flat and calculating no matter how wide the smile stretched. Jingu, Choi Min-jun said, like they were old friends running into each other at a restaurant. I heard about your mother. Terrible timing. Illness. It never asks permission. You have 30 seconds to explain why you're on this floor, Jingu said, his voice a low, controlled blade, before I stop caring whose hospital this is. I came to pay respects, Choi said, spreading his hands innocently, though his eyes slid sideways to Annie, with a deliberateness that made her skin crawl. And to meet the wife everyone talks about, the American who tamed the untamable Jingu. His smile widened. Though I hear she signed papers recently. Tragic, if the rumors are true. I'd hate to see the great alliance fall apart from the inside, when we're all working so hard to break it from the outside. Annie felt the blood drain from her face. He knew about the papers too. Which meant the leak Jingu suspected inside his own house wasn't just feeding information about hospital rooms and text messages, it was feeding everything. Careful, Jingu said quietly, stepping half in front of Annie, without seeming to think about it, an instinct so automatic it startled her more than anything Choi had said. You're on thin ice already coming here. Don't give me a second reason to end this in a hospital hallway. Relax, Choi said, holding up both hands, though the smile never dropped. I'm a reasonable man. I simply came to offer condolences, and perhaps a bit of advice. His gaze flicked to Annie again, and this time it lingered, assessing her the way you'd assess a piece on a chessboard you were deciding whether to sacrifice or protect. Your husband's family has taken things from mine, Mrs. Kang, things that can never be returned. I only think it's fair that debts eventually come due, one way or another. Is that a threat? Annie said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. Or are you always this dramatic when you're trying to impress a woman you've just met? For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Choi's composed face. Genuine surprise, quickly smoothed back into amusement. Beside her, Annie thought she heard the faintest exhale from Jingu that might have been a laugh, buried fast under the tension of the moment. But wait, here's where it gets crazy. Because Choi's smile sharpened into something colder, and he took one measured step closer. Close enough that the guard nearest Jingu shifted his weight. Close enough that Annie's heart slammed against her ribs. You have spirit, Choi said softly. I can see why he kept you around this long. But spirit doesn't stop bullets, Mrs. Kang, and it certainly won't stop what's coming for this family. Tell your husband, his eyes cut to Jingu, all pretense of friendliness gone now, that my father remembers exactly what happened to my brother, and my father does not believe in letting debts go unpaid, even generations later. The hallway went dead silent. Jingu's whole body had gone rigid, and Annie realized, with a chill crawling up her spine, that whatever history existed between these two families ran far deeper than she'd ever been told, deeper than a rivalry, deeper than business. Something personal. Something with a body count that had a name attached to it. Your brother made his own choices, Jingu said, voice like ice cracking underfoot. Choices that got him killed by his own recklessness, not by my hand. That's not what my father believes, Choi said. And in this family, what my father believes is the only truth that matters. He glanced once more at Annie, and something in his expression shifted, not quite pity, but close to it. I almost feel sorry for you, married into a family with this much blood behind it. Almost. He turned, unhurried again, and stepped back into the waiting elevator, his 2 guards falling in behind him without a word. Just before the door slid shut, he looked at Jingu one last time. Give your mother my regards, he said. I do hope she recovers. It would be such a shame if something happened to her before we've had the chance to properly settle things between our families. The elevator doors closed. For a long moment, neither Annie nor Jingu moved. The threat hung in the air behind Choi like smoke that refused to clear, and Annie realized her hands were shaking again, not from grief this time, but from something colder and far more immediate, fear. What did he mean? Annie said slowly. About his brother? Jingu's jaw was so tight it looked painful. It's not a story for a hospital hallway. Jingu. Not here, he said, and there was something almost pleading underneath the command in his voice, a rawness she'd rarely heard from him. Please, Annie, not here, not now, not with my mother 20 feet away on a ventilator, and a leak somewhere in my own house feeding information to the man who just threatened your life in front of me. If you've been holding your breath through that entire exchange, same. This is exactly the kind of tension I live for in these stories, and if you're feeling it too, make sure you're subscribed, because we are far from finished. Mrs. O emerged from the room a moment later, a small army of nurses behind her wheeling the old woman's bed, tubes and monitors carefully repositioned for transport. We're ready, Mrs. O said, then paused, taking in the tension still crackling in the hallway. What happened? Choi Min-jun happened, Jingu said grimly, already moving to help guide the bed, his hand briefly brushing his mother's frail one as the gurney passed. Change of plans. We're not taking the service elevator. I want a full sweep of every exit before we move her, and I want Annie in the car with 2 of my best men the second we're clear. I'm staying with your mother, Annie said immediately. Annie, you said it yourself, she said, meeting his eyes, refusing to back down even as her whole body trembled with adrenaline. She asked me not to leave. I'm not leaving. Not her. And not... She stopped herself, the sentence hanging unfinished in the space between them, both of them clearly hearing the word she hadn't said. Not you either. Something passed between them then, wordless and fragile, and for just a moment, the chaos of the hallway, the threat from Choi, the leak in the house, all of it seemed to fall away, leaving just the 2 of them looking at each other, like they were seeing something new for the first time. Fine, Jingu said finally, voice rough, but you stay exactly where my men can see you. No exceptions. They moved as a unit down the hallway, the old woman's bed rolling steadily between them, Mrs. O murmuring softly to her in Korean, Jingu's hand never leaving the rail of the gurney. Annie walked close beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed with every step, and neither of them pulled away. They made it to the private elevator without incident. The doors slid shut, sealing them into a small, tense silence, the old woman's monitor beeping steadily between them. And that's when the elevator jolted, hard, and the lights above them flickered once, twice, then went completely dark. If your heart just dropped, good, because so did mine writing it. Comment part 2 right now if you need to know what happens in that elevator, because I promise you, this story is about to get a whole lot more dangerous. For a full 3 seconds, there was nothing but darkness, and the frantic, uneven beeping of the mother's monitor, now running on backup battery. Nobody move, Jingu said, voice low and controlled, even as Annie felt her own pulse hammering in her throat. Emergency lights should kick in within. A dim red glow flickered to life along the base of the elevator, casting everyone's face in shadow. Mrs. O had one hand pressed protectively over the old woman's chest, murmuring something soothing in Korean, while the old woman's eyes fluttered open, hazy but alert. Power failure, Jingu muttered, already pulling out his phone, jabbing at the screen. No signal. This building has 3 separate backup systems. This isn't a coincidence. You think Choi did this? Annie said, though it wasn't really a question. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. I think, Jingu said grimly, that a man doesn't walk into a hospital, threaten my wife to her face, and leave without making sure he has a way to finish what he started. The elevator groaned, metal straining somewhere above them, and for one horrifying second, Annie was certain they were about to freefall. Instead, it lurched sideways slightly and went still, suspended, apparently, between floors. We need to get her out of here, Annie said, glancing at the old woman, whose breathing had gone shallow and quick, panic clearly setting into her frail body, despite Mrs. O's soft reassurances. There's an access panel, Jingu said, already moving toward the ceiling, running his hands along the seams. Emergency protocol for exactly this. It leads to a maintenance shaft 2 floors up from the private wing. You're not seriously suggesting we climb her out of a broken elevator on a ventilator, Annie said. I'm suggesting, Jingu said, finding the panel and forcing it open with a grunt, that we don't have another option, because if this was Choi, then whoever cut this power is likely already on their way down that shaft to finish the job, and I would rather meet them halfway than wait here for them to arrive. But wait, here's where it gets even crazier. Because just as Jingu got the panel open, a soft mechanical click echoed from somewhere above them. Deliberate, precise, unmistakably the sound of a lock disengaging on the maintenance hatch 2 floors up. Someone was already in the shaft. Jingu froze, one hand still braced against the open panel, his whole body going taut with the particular stillness Annie had learned meant violence was seconds away. Get behind me, he said quietly. Now. Annie didn't argue. She stepped back, pressing herself against the elevator wall beside Mrs. O and the gurney, close enough to see the old woman's eyes tracking the ceiling with the same sharp alertness Annie remembered from that first day in the marble foyer 3 years ago. A pair of boots appeared in the gap of the open panel, dangling, feeling for footing. Jingu didn't wait to see a face. He grabbed the ankle and yanked, hard, and a man came crashing down through the panel with a strangled shout, landing in a heap on the elevator floor. Before he could recover, Jingu had a knee in his back, and something small and metallic pressed against the base of his skull, a gun Annie hadn't even seen him draw. Who sent you? Jingu said, voice deadly calm. The man on the floor said nothing, chest heaving, eyes wide with the particular terror of someone realizing exactly how badly a plan had gone wrong. I asked you a question, Jingu said, pressing harder. Choi, the man gasped finally. Choi Min-jun. He said just the old woman. Just make it look like the power failure took her. Nothing about killing anyone else. Annie's stomach turned over. They hadn't sent someone to threaten the family. They'd sent someone to make sure the mother never left that elevator alive, disguised as an accident, a tragic footnote to an already fragile health crisis. He's lying, the old woman rasped suddenly from the gurney, her voice thin, but sharp enough to cut through the tension. Everyone turned to look at her. Or he's not lying about the order. But he doesn't know the whole plan. Look at his jacket. Jingu's eyes flicked down, and Annie followed his gaze. Tucked half visible in the man's inner pocket was a second device. Small, black, with a blinking red light that made Annie's blood run cold even before Jingu spoke. That's not a tool for sabotaging a power grid, Jingu said slowly, voice tightening. That's a detonator. If you're gripping your phone right now the way I gripped my keyboard writing this, good, because we are not done. If you've made it this far and you're loving the chaos, hit subscribe, because I promise the twist coming up is going to make your jaw hit the floor. Where is it? Jingu said, pressing the gun harder against the man's skull. The device. Where? Under the car, the man choked out. Below us. It's set to a timer, not remote. I couldn't stop it now, even if I wanted to. How long? Annie said, her voice cracking with panic she couldn't hide anymore. The man's eyes found the small clock readout blinking faintly through the gap in his jacket. 4 minutes, he whispered. The elevator suddenly felt very, very small. The shaft, Jingu said immediately, hauling the man up by his collar and shoving him toward the open panel, forcing him to lead the way as a human shield against whatever waited above. Mrs. O, get her onto the gurney straps. We're going to have to move her through the gap manually. She can't survive that kind of movement, Jingu. Her heart just stabilized. She can't survive an explosion either, Jingu snapped. And Annie had never heard him sound so close to breaking. "Annie, help me with the straps." Annie moved without thinking, hands shaking as she worked alongside Mrs. O to secure the old woman, whose eyes found Annie's in the dim red emergency light, calm in a way that felt almost otherworldly given the chaos around them. "You came back," the old woman whispered, so quiet only Annie could hear it. "Even after everything, even knowing what I did to you. We're not finishing this conversation in a bomb-rigged elevator," Annie said, voice thick with tears she didn't have time to shed. "You're going to yell at me for staying later, when we're both still alive to argue about it." Something that might have been a laugh, weak and rattling, escaped the old woman's throat. Jingu had gotten the first man through the shaft, disappearing into the darkness above with a muffled curse, and turned back, reaching down through the gap. "Pass her up," he said. "Carefully. I've got her." 3 minutes. Annie and Mrs. O lifted together, straining against the weight of the gurney frame, guiding the old woman's fragile body up toward Jingu's waiting hands, every second stretching unbearably long. 2 minutes. "Annie, you next," Jingu said, voice tight with strain, as he braced his mother against the shaft wall above. "Mrs. O first," Annie said immediately. "There's no time to argue." "Then don't argue," Annie snapped, already boosting Mrs. O up toward the gap. "Just move. 1 minute." Mrs. O disappeared through the panel. Annie reached up, Jingu's hand closing around her wrist and hauling her up with a strength that felt almost violent in its urgency, dragging her through the narrow gap just as, somewhere below them, a soft mechanical whine began to build. "Go, go, go," Jingu shouted, half carrying, half dragging both women and his mother's stretcher down the narrow maintenance corridor, as fast as the confined space would allow, putting as much distance as physically possible between them and the elevator shaft below. The explosion, when it came, wasn't the enormous fireball Annie had braced for. It was a dull, concussive thud that rattled through the walls and floor, throwing all 4 of them forward in a tangle of limbs, and a fresh, panicked scream from the old woman's monitor as it disconnected briefly from her chest. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Somewhere below, alarms began blaring, and the corridor lights flickered back on, harsh and fluorescent, illuminating 4 people sprawled across a maintenance hallway, alive, breathing, coughing through the haze, but alive. Jingu was the first to move, scrambling to his mother's side, reconnecting the monitor lead with hands that were, for the first time since Annie had known him, visibly shaking. "Uma," he said, voice cracking completely now, all pretense of control gone. "Uma, stay with me." The old woman's eyes fluttered, found his face, and despite everything, despite the smoke, the alarms, the sheer impossibility of surviving the last 4 minutes, the corner of her mouth curved into something that looked almost like satisfaction. "You called me Uma," she whispered, "the way you used to when you were small. I haven't heard that in years. If your chest is tight right now, mine was too. But we are not finished. Because as the dust settles and the alarms blare through the hospital, Annie's phone buzzes one more time in her pocket, and the message on the screen is about to change absolutely everything. Comment part 2 right now if you need to see what that message says, because I promise you, this story does not end where you think it does. Annie's hands were still trembling from the blast, dust coating her hair and clothes, but the buzzing in her pocket cut through the ringing in her ears like a blade. She pulled out her phone with fingers that barely cooperated. Another unknown number. Another message, shorter than the first. That was a warning. The next one won't miss. And Mrs. Kang, you should ask your husband what really happened to Choi Min-jun's brother, before you decide whose side you're standing on. Annie stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly through the dust, and adrenaline still coursing through her. She looked up, found Jingu still crouched beside his mother's gurney in the harsh fluorescent light of the maintenance corridor, his hands cupped protectively around the old woman's face, as paramedics finally reached them, shouting instructions, swarming the narrow hallway with equipment and urgency. "Jingu," Annie said, and something in her voice made him look up immediately. Some instinct in him attuned now to every shift in her tone. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." His face, still streaked with dust and something rawer underneath it, went carefully still. "Annie, this isn't the time. What happened to Choi Min-jun's brother?" she asked. "The real story. Not the version everyone tells. For a long moment, Jingu said nothing. The paramedics were already lifting his mother's gurney, wheeling her down the corridor toward the working elevator bank at the far end, Mrs. O hurrying alongside them. And still, Jingu didn't move, didn't answer. His eyes locked on Annie's, like he was trying to decide how much of himself he could afford to hand her. But wait, here's where the story takes the turn you didn't see coming. I killed him, Jingu said quietly. Choi's brother, 3 years ago, 2 months before you arrived in Seoul. The corridor seemed to tilt beneath Annie's feet, for what felt like the 10th time that day. He wasn't collateral in some business dispute, Jingu continued, voice low and steady, even as something behind his eyes cracked wide open. He came after my mother first, tried to take her, the same way Choi is trying now, except 3 years ago, I wasn't careful. I wasn't fast enough. By the time I got to her, he'd already, his voice broke, just slightly, just enough for Annie to hear exactly how much this had cost him to carry alone for 3 years. He'd already hurt her, badly. I made sure he never touched anyone in this family again. Annie's mind reeled, pieces sliding into place with a sickening clarity. The scar she'd once glimpsed along the old woman's collarbone, and never asked about. The extra security that had tripled the month before Annie's arrival. The way Jingu flinched, almost imperceptibly, every time his mother left the house alone. You never told me, Annie whispered. Because you married into a family with blood already on its hands before you ever set foot in this country, Jingu said. And for the first time, real shame cracked through his voice. I didn't tell you because I was afraid that if you knew the whole truth from the start, you would have run the very first week. And some selfish part of me didn't want to give you the chance. If you're sitting there stunned right now, trust me, I was too, writing this twist. This is exactly the kind of gut punch I build these stories around. So if you're loving the chaos, make sure you've hit that subscribe button, because we are almost to the end of this part. Annie opened her mouth to respond. Grief, anger, something tangled and enormous rising in her chest, when a sharp voice cut through the corridor. Sir! One of Jingu's men came sprinting from the direction of the working elevators, face pale, breathless. Sir, you need to come now. It's the transport team, the ones escorting your mother to the secure floor. Jingu was moving before the man finished the sentence, sprinting down the corridor with a speed that left Annie scrambling to keep pace, her heart in her throat. The message from Choi's people still glowing accusingly on the phone clutched in her hand. They rounded the corner into the main hallway to chaos. 2 of Jingu's guards on the ground, unconscious or worse, the gurney nowhere in sight. Mrs. O pressed against the wall with blood running from a cut above her eyebrow, screaming something in Korean that Annie didn't need translated to understand. They had taken her, while the elevator exploded below to draw every eye and every guard toward the blast. Someone had used the chaos as cover, and in the 4 minutes it had taken Jingu to save his mother from a bomb, someone else had simply walked her right out the front door. She's gone, Mrs. O sobbed, gripping Jingu's arm as he reached her, his face draining of every last trace of color. They took her, Jingu, right out of the elevator bank, right in front of everyone, and no one could stop them. Jingu's phone buzzed in his hand at that exact moment. Slowly, hand shaking for the first time Annie had ever witnessed, he turned the screen toward her. One new message. Unknown number, a photo attached. The old woman, eyes closed, unconscious but breathing, propped in the back of an unmarked car, an IV bag dangling loosely beside her, a single line of text beneath the image. Your move, Jingu. You have 24 hours before I decide she's not worth keeping alive. And Mrs. Kang, if you're reading this too, you might want to reconsider which family actually deserves your loyalty, before it's too late to choose. Annie's whole body went cold, the phone in Jingu's hand trembling as violently as her own pulse hammering in her ears. 24 hours, Jingu said, voice a broken whisper, staring at the photo of his dying mother, alive but stolen, ripped away in the span of minutes after surviving an explosion neither of them thought they'd walk away from. 24 hours, and I don't even know where to start looking. Annie looked down at the divorce papers still sitting, forgotten, at the bottom of her bag. A marriage she had walked into this hospital ready to end, now tangled irreversibly with blood debts, dead brothers, a stolen mother, and a countdown clock that had just started ticking towards something neither of them could undo. Then we start now, Annie said, surprising herself with how steady her own voice came out, reaching for Jingu's hand, the way his mother had reached for hers less than 3 hours earlier. Together. Because whatever happens next, I'm not signing those papers until she's home safe. All three of us are getting out of this alive. Jingu's fingers closed around hers, tight, desperate, grateful in a way that needed no words. And somewhere across the city, in a location neither of them yet knew, the clock kept ticking down toward 24 hours, toward an ending that would either save this fractured family or destroy every last piece of it for good. To be continued. If this story had you on the edge of your seat, you know what to do. Comment Part 2 right now if you need to know whether Jingu gets his mother back, whether Annie ever signs those papers, and what really happens when the 24 hours run out. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. And before you go, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one. See you in Part 2.